Dora Finch had run the Finch Ferry crossing for 7 years, since the year her father's hands had stopped being reliable enough to work the cable, and he had handed her the lever with the matter-of-fact brevity of a man transferring a tool rather than a livelihood. The ferry was a flat-bottomed platform, 20 feet by 14, cable drawn across the Aldrin River at the point where the current ran slowest, and the banks were close enough that a strong pull could bring a loaded wagon across in under 4 minutes. It was not a crossing that required great physical strength, but it required judgment about the water level, about the weight of a load, about the weather building over the western ridge, about whether a team was going to hold steady on a moving platform or decide midway that it wasn't. Dora had the judgment. She had been watching the river since she was 8 years old, and she understood it, the way you understand something you have been in conversation with for 20 years. Which is to say, she read it the way other people read faces. The crossing was a mile north of Dawes Creek, which was the nearest town, and Dora went into town on Thursdays for provisions and banking and to collect the week's mail, and came back the same day. She had a dog named Patch, and a vegetable garden on the south bank, and a record book going back to the year her father had taken over from the man before him, and the record book was the most complete account of the Aldrin River's behavior at that crossing that existed anywhere, and she had shown it to no one. She was 33 years old. She had been left twice, once by a man who had come to help with the crossing for a season and had found the isolation less romantic than he had expected, and once by a man who had been earnest and kind and had waited until the second winter to discover that earnest and kind were not sufficient for a life at a river crossing on their own. She had stopped expecting otherwise, and had found this not as bleak as it sounded. Expectation, she had learned, was its own kind of weight, and she had become practiced at setting it down before it cost too much. The man who came across on a Wednesday afternoon in April with a loaded wagon and a horse that had not entirely decided to trust the ferry was not unusual in any of those particulars, except the last. The horse's name she did not know. The man's name she learned from the ferry ledger when he signed it at the end of the crossing. James Cord, and a county from the Eastern Valley she had not heard from in some time. He was somewhere past 40, not tall, with the kind of face that had been working outdoors long enough that the elements had finished it and it would not change much further. He had a box of tools in the wagon bed and 2 crates she could not see into, and the horse, which was a good horse in most respects, and was communicating its concerns about the moving platform with a particular quality of stillness that was the opposite of calm. She said she would need him to stand at the horse's head during the crossing. He said he knew. She said some men had trouble judging the right amount of pressure on the lead. He said he had crossed moving water before, which was not quite the same as an answer, but was close enough. He stood at the horse's head, and she worked the cable, and the horse held, and the wagon held, and the crossing was clean. He signed the ledger at the south bank, and paid the toll, and stood looking at the river for a moment before he got back in the wagon. He said, that horse would not have crossed for most people. She said the crossing was better when the horse trusted the handler. He looked at the river. He said he had work at a property up the North Road and would likely be crossing again in the coming weeks. She said the fee was the same each direction. He said he would keep that in mind. He drove up the North Road, and she wound the cable back to center and noted the crossing in the record book and went back to the garden. He came back across on a Friday evening. Empty wagon, horse considerably more settled than the first crossing, and then again the following Tuesday with a partial load, and on the third crossing she asked about the property on the North Road, out of the ordinary interest she took in who was working land near the crossing, because the land use affected the crossings, and he said it was a repair job, a barn, and some outbuildings on a place that had been sitting idle 2 seasons. He said it would take most of the month. She noted this in the record book under the date, which she had not done with any other crossing in recent memory, because the record book was for river data and relevant variables, and she had decided that knowing the work at the North Road property would run a month was relevant to the crossing schedule. She did not think about this decision at any length. He crossed 6 times in the first 3 weeks, twice with loads, and 4 times empty, and the horse by the fourth crossing walked onto the platform with the easy resignation of an animal that has decided this is simply part of what Wednesdays and Fridays were now. She had not spoken to him much beyond the practical. He had not offered more than was asked, which she found she did not mind the way she had come to mind the men who filled silences with themselves. He paid at the end of each crossing, and thanked her in the brief way of someone for whom thanking is not a performance, and drove on. She began to know the sound of that particular horse on the north bank approach before it came into sight. The way the hooves came down at a slightly uneven interval that was not lameness, but some settled habit of the animal's stride. She noted the days he came more precisely in the record book than she had been noting crossings for some time. Patch had made his opinion clear by the second crossing, which was that James Cord was acceptable, and Patch's opinions were not easily won, a fact she had come to rely on over 3 years, and which she had not told anyone, because it would have sounded stranger than it was. The thing about the crossing life that she had not found a way to explain to the 2 men who had left was that the river was not quiet in any sense that meant empty. The river was continuously occupied with itself in ways that required attention and that rewarded the kind of mind that did not need external noise to feel the presence of something. She had tried to say this once, and had found no language for it that the man she was talking to could receive as anything other than loneliness, dressed up as philosophy, and she had not tried again. The first man who had left had said the river made him feel small, which she had understood as an accurate description of his experience, and which told her something about what he needed that the crossing could not provide. The second man had said it was the isolation, that the town was too far and the people too few, and she had listened to this and had thought about the record book and the 27 years of river data it contained, and the conversation she had with the river every day that most people did not know was happening, and she had understood that the isolation he described was real, and that for her it was the condition that made everything else possible, and that these 2 facts could both be true and still not be reconcilable. She had not said any of this to either man, because there was nothing useful in saying it. She had helped them pack, and she had noted their final crossing in the record book in the same clear hand she used for everything, because they had crossed the river, and the crossing was what the record book was for. James Cord arrived at the crossing on the 4th week on a Tuesday morning with no wagon and no horse, walking, which was unusual. The town of Dawes Creek had begun to remark on the frequency of his crossings, which she had learned from the provisioner on her Thursday trip, who had mentioned it with the warm interest of a woman who finds other people's patterns worth discussing. The provisioner had said the man from the Eastern Valley seemed to find the crossing convenient, which was a way of saying more than it said. Dora had agreed that it was a convenient crossing, which was a way of saying less. She did not find the observation unpleasant, which she noted as itself a thing worth noticing. He said the barn work was done, and he was settling accounts with the property owner, and would likely need one more crossing with the wagon at the end of the week. She said she would be here. He said he knew. He did not move immediately toward the ferry. He said the view from the south bank this time of day was better than the north, and he wondered if she had noticed that. She said she had noticed it the first spring she had run the crossing, and had spent some time since then trying to understand what made the light sit differently on the south side in the morning. He looked at the river. He said it was the angle of the ridge on the north side, that it blocked the direct eastern light until mid-morning, so the south bank held the softer indirect light longer. She looked at the ridge. She looked at the river. She said she had thought it was something to do with the watercolor. He said the watercolor was probably part of it. He stayed at the south bank for 20 minutes, looking at the light on the river, and she went back to the record book and noted the observation about the ridge, because it was accurate, and the record book was the place for accurate things. He crossed with the wagon on Friday, as he had said. The horse got on the platform without any discussion whatsoever. At the south bank, he signed the ledger for the last time and stood for a moment looking at the record book. which she had left open at that day's entry. He said the book went back a long way. She said her father had started it when he had taken over the crossing. He said it was a significant record. She said it was the most complete account of the river at that crossing that existed, and that she had shown it to no one. He looked at her. She looked at the book. She had not planned to say that second part, and she could not have said exactly why she had said it, except that the ridge observation had been accurate, and had been received as accurate, and had been placed in the record book, which was where accurate things went, and something about that had loosened the usual care she took about what she let out. He drove the wagon up the road. She closed the record book. She thought about the second part of what she had said for the rest of the afternoon, without arriving at a conclusion that required her to do anything, which was the kind of thinking she was best at. The 1st of May was the date she had put in the record book the year before, to note when the western tributary would likely affect the main current and require a weight adjustment on the cable. She had the adjustment in hand on the morning of the 1st, when she heard a horse on the north bank. It was James Cord with no wagon, which was the second time he had crossed on foot. He crossed and paid and stood on the south bank and said the North Road property was settled and he was heading back to the Eastern Valley, but he had some time before the obligation there started, and he had found work in Dawes Creek for a few weeks if it suited him. She said work in Dawes Creek was generally plentiful this time of year. He said he had noticed that. He looked at the cable anchor. He said the tributary had come up. She said she had adjusted for it this morning. He said it would likely hold another 3 inches before she needed to reassess the load limit. She looked at the cable. She said she had thought the same. He said the South Bank garden was coming in early for April. She said it was a good bed, well drained. He said he could see that. He looked at the river, and then at her, and he said he had a question that was not about the cable or the garden. She waited. He said he had crossed the Aldrin at this crossing 8 times in 3 weeks, and had found it to be a better crossing than most, and better company than most, and he was wondering if she would have supper with him in Dawes Creek on a Thursday. She said she went to Dawes Creek on Thursdays. He said he knew. She looked at the river, and then at him, and she said there was something she should tell him first. He waited. She said there had been 2 men who had come to the crossing and found the life at the river too much of what it was and too little of what they had expected, and that she did not want to have that conversation a 3rd time, which was what every beginning of something led to eventually, and that she was saying this not to discourage him, but because she had decided some time ago that honesty at the beginning was better than hope that turned expensive later. He listened to all of it. He was quiet for a moment. He said he had spent the better part of 20 years working jobs that moved and had arrived at a clear understanding that he had been looking in the wrong places for the quality of thing that did not move, and that a river crossing was, in his understanding, the opposite of the kind of thing that moved. She looked at him. He said the crossing stayed. The river changed, but the crossing stayed in its place, which was its whole purpose, and which seemed to him like a thing worth staying near. She said no man had ever stayed. He said he was not going anywhere. He said it quietly, and without the kind of certainty that is actually confidence borrowed against a future it has not earned yet. He said it the way a man says a thing he has thought through, and means at the level that thought reaches. She looked at the record book. She looked at the river. She said Thursday. He said he would meet her at the east end of the main street at noon. He crossed back to the north bank, and she watched him go, and then she went to the record book and noted the water level and the cable adjustment and the tributary reading, and did not write down what else had occurred on the south bank that morning, because the record book was for river data, and what had been said was something else entirely, and it had its own kind of record that did not require paper. Thursday, they had supper at the hotel in Dawes Creek, and talked for 2 hours about the river, and about the Eastern Valley, and about the property work he did, and the particular challenges of working someone else's land with materials you had not chosen. He asked about the record book, what the patterns looked like across years, whether the river had changed in the time she had been watching it. She told him what the book said, which was more than she had told anyone, and he listened the way he did everything, with the full attention of a man who has decided this conversation is the one worth being in. After supper, he walked her to the wagon, and she drove back to the crossing, and it was still light when she got there, and Patch was at the bank, and the river was doing what the river did in early May, which was moving with the particular energy of water that has recently been snow and has not entirely settled into being river yet. She sat with Patch at the south bank in the last light, and thought about what he had said about the crossing staying, which was an accurate observation about a crossing, and which was also something more than that, and which she had already put in the same place she put everything accurate, which was the place she went back to when she needed to know what was true. He stayed in Dawes Creek for the 3 weeks he had described, and he crossed on Tuesdays and Thursdays without fail, and on one of the Tuesdays he crossed on foot and helped her replace the cable sheathing on the South Bank anchor, which had been needing attention since the previous fall, and which genuinely required 2 people to do correctly. He knew how to work a cable anchor. He did not make more of knowing this than it warranted. They had supper in Dawes Creek every Thursday, and once on a Saturday, when the work in Dawes Creek had run long, and neither of them had found a good reason to end the evening, when the hotel was still lit, and the night was clear, and there were 2 more hours of things they had not said yet. At the end of the 3rd week he crossed on a Friday with a packed saddle roll on the horse, and she knew before he reached the south bank what the saddle roll meant. She was at the cable. He got off the horse. He said the Dawes Creek work was done, and the Eastern Valley obligation was starting. He said it would run 4 months. She said she expected that was right for that kind of work. He said he would be back in September. She said the river ran differently in September, that it was one of the better crossing months. He looked at the record book on its shelf inside the landing shelter. He said, "When I come back in September, I want to ask you something." She said she would be here. He said, "I know." He crossed to the north bank and rode up the road, and she watched him go past the point where the road curved and he was no longer visible, and then she went to the record book and noted the crossing and the cable condition and set the book back on the shelf and went to start the evening work, and Patch sat at the edge of the bank and watched the north road for a while before giving it up and coming back to the landing. September came the way. September comes at a river crossing, with the water lower and clearer, and the light going earlier each day, and the particular smell of the river in the dry month that was different from every other month, and that she had been noting in the record book for 7 years. He came across on the first Thursday of September with a full wagon and the horse, and a look that was the same look he had carried across the river 9 weeks earlier, the settled look of a man who has been somewhere else for the interval and has not changed his mind about where he was going. He crossed and signed the ledger and paid the toll and drove the wagon to the South Bank flat and got down and stood at the wagon and said he had something to ask. She set the cable. She said she remembered. He said the property work in the Eastern Valley had run well, and he had enough now to put into something settled, and that settled was what he had been working toward for 20 years, and that the crossing was the most settled place he had found, and the person running it was the reason it was the most settled place. He said, "I want to stay at this crossing." He said, "As your husband, if that is what you want." She had the record book in her mind, the way she always had it when she was at the cable, the 20 years of her father's notes before her 7 years, the cumulative picture of a river that had been read carefully by the same family for nearly 3 decades. The river at this crossing in September was the river she knew best of all, the low, clear version of it that showed the bed and ran without the urgency of the spring and the volume of the summer, and she had stood at this cable in September for 7 years and had come each time to the same conclusion about the crossing, which was that it was a good crossing and that she was the right person for it, and that this was sufficient. She had come to that conclusion alone each September. She thought about the 2 men who had left. She thought about what he had said in May, that the crossing stayed, and that it was its whole purpose. She thought about a man who had crossed the Aldrin River 9 times, and had learned the cable anchor, and had asked about the record book, and had come back in September when he said he would. She said yes. That is what she wanted. He took her hand and held it, the way you hold something you have come a long way to get to and have no intention of putting down. They married in November, at the crossing, which was the right place. The circuit minister came across on the ferry and said the service on the south bank with the river behind them and the ridge above and Patch in attendance, which no one had arranged and no one had the standing to object to. James took on the property work in the surrounding valley and came home to the crossing each evening, and the horse had an opinion about this arrangement that consisted entirely of being ready at the same hour every afternoon, which Dora noted in the record book, not as river data, but in the margin, because the margins were for the things that mattered and were not the river. In the third year, he built a second room onto the South Bank house, which had always been one room and a shelf and a stove, and the second room had a window that faced the river, the same way the first room's window faced the river, because that was where the light was, and they both knew where the light was. The record book on its shelf, inside the landing shelter, continued, each day's entry in the same clear hand her father had established, and she had continued, the water level, and the cable tension, and the load crossings, the tributary readings in May, and the drawdown in September. In the margin of the September entries, going back 3 years now, was a different kind of notation, small and precise in her hand, which said only, he came back. She had written it the 1st September because it was accurate, and the record book was for accurate things. She had written it the 2nd September because it was still true. She had written it the 3rd September because accuracy, like a river crossing, was not a thing you noted once and considered done. It required the daily attention of someone who understood that the thing worth recording was the thing that kept being true. And that was the story of Dora, who learned to read a river before she learned to read anything else, and who finally found someone who understood that